early on, the lesson I kind of learned was that you had to be very careful with what you said politically. And for me, that meant, not really just in school, but also on social media. Someone might, and there were times where I was told, like, well, a teacher sent me a screenshot of something you said, and it doesn't really vibe with the politics of this community, which is a mostly, Illinois. It's a Democrat area. And, you want to be mindful of that. So, if you read between the lines, you knew that, like, there could be job action, not directly. They're never going to come right out and say, like, you're fired for your political speech. They'll just evaluate you out. They'll just start saying you're a bad teacher, you scored negative on the evaluation system. So they're really sneaky about the way they do it. Now, I went through some times where I was getting kind of frustrated at that attitude. Like, what do you mean I can't, like, look, there were two sets of rules. If you were a liberal teacher, you could be as openly liberal as you wanted. You could, have a liberal left-leaning blog. You could say you were a communist. No one would say anything. And my contention was like, okay, if you don't want me to have a political presence on social media, that rule has to apply to everyone. But that wasn't the case. What I did, and I'll talk about that in a second, was very specific to kind of the historical moment we were in 2020. And I don't know if I would necessarily recommend the exact same course of action again, because now we've been able to kind of move the window a little bit to allow some teachers to push back a little more. I'm not saying that it's easy or that it's, much, much better, but schools have been kind of put on notice by a lot of people. And but it took a lot of work to get to that point. It took, people like Paul Rossi, Tony Kinnett, myself to kind of push the envelope to where more teachers might be comfortable challenging the status quo. And schools also started to get a little nervous, like, well, if this, if these teachers and if these parents make a big fuss and get media attention, do we really want to have that situation come to our school district? So there might be some leverage in that regards with teachers. But what I basically did was, this is 2020, where, like, right after George Floyd, teachers are getting axed for, the most benign of, saying, for example, hey, I don't know if, I don't think George Floyd was murdered. I think that it may have been XYZ. Whether or not you agree with that or not, today we'd be like, okay, that's not really a controversial statement. Those types of things, you'd be gone. So people were very scared, and you had to be very careful. And what I wanted to do, there were kind of two things. One, I just, at first it kind of started off where I was like, I want to talk about this stuff. I want to start a blog. I want to have my own voice that's kind of, chalkboard heresy, which is, basically kind of heretical to the orthodoxy in education. And I knew that was a huge liability. I was like, okay, if I even, like, this is going to get me, on the road to being tossed out the moment it goes up there. And very quickly, the minute it did go up there, already I was like getting emails from people. And at the time, I wasn't putting anything, I wasn't trying to push the envelope. I later did. But what I realized was that at that moment, I had two choices. It was, I could be quiet forever, just go along with things, focus on keeping my job, and make peace with that. That wasn't an option. Or, I could kind of speak out against this. But I knew that once I did speak out against what was going on and came forward with my views, that there was going to be kind of like a countdown clock beginning. They were going to be like, okay, time to force Frank McCormick out is going to begin the minute you start this. So I kind of made a strategic decision to try and, as quickly as possible, get as many people following me on social media to buy myself some time, to make the district kind of nervous. Like, ooh, if we all of a sudden just jump on him and fire him and start disciplining him, and he's got, originally I planned, I was like, hey, if I get 1,000 people, well, then we're going to be in trouble. So that's what I did. And yeah, that involved kind of, some sensationalism, some kind of energy that I had to come out with and entertain people and be like, hey, I'm a teacher, I'm fighting back, here's what I'm saying, follow me. And it worked initially, and for quite a long time. It was kind of like the more followers, the more I built and the more bold I got, the more news outlets I went on, the more the district really started to get nervous. Like, what do we do? Because it kind of broke all the rules. They're used to, like, coming at people just kind of indirectly, like, hey, we noticed you post this on social media. You might want to think about that. And people are like, oh, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again. And I'm just like, hey, I'm saying all this stuff. What are you going to do about it? So they didn't know what to do. And from what I heard from, like, certain friends I had that were administrators, it was pretty chaotic on the inside. And I knew that it was, they'll eventually would catch up to me. This was Waukegan, which is, let's see, how do you describe it? It's a pretty big city in Illinois. It's over 100,000. It's, you know, 70% Hispanic, 20% Black, pretty liberal area. And and yeah, so but what's funny is that most of the backlash was not from, like, the community. It wasn't from, like, Hispanic people or Black. It was like from, a lot of, like, white liberals in the school system that really wanted to get me out. Um, so, but I knew kind of where things were going to go. So then, as time went on, I'm like, okay, gotta now start to show people more concrete evidence. It's one thing to have an opinion and to, now I got to show people. Started to, like, take teacher lesson plans that clearly had a bias or inside documents from the DEI department. I just started to unload them on Twitter, um, because I felt it was important to substantiate what a lot of people knew was happening, but didn't necessarily have the proof. And eventually it got to the point, it wasn't like, they called me in to there were numerous phone calls and meetings, and, it kind of culminated with they had me meet with their attorney, the school district, and kind of vaguely threatened me that, these things might happen. And eventually what I did was I, went to a school board meeting in January. I kind of, I felt like I'd done as much as I could, and teachers, had already, like, everyone knew what was going on. So everyone had pulled their stuff off the shared Google Drives that I was using to kind of, show examples of what was happening in the classroom, you know, kind of let the superintendent have it, told him what I thought, and then resigned shortly after. Um, People say, like, that was a success story. I mean, I was on the way out. I don't know, I'd been told by a friend who's an administrator, like, Frank, they're going to get you out. They're either going to start to evaluate you out or they're going to look for something. Um, so, is that a victory? I think it made me feel good that I kind of was able to end up my terms, and they couldn't take action against my teaching license. But I'd also kind of exhausted the course of things, and I had to, having a family, I had to make sure that I, was able to jump ship to a, I'm sorry, to another job, rather than just let that one, derail where I'm, out the next day and have no paycheck. So, you know, is that gonna, would I recommend that for everyone? Obviously not. I think it was very risky. I'm kind of a risk taker, I've seen some people try to do a similar thing, but they're not able to get as many followers, and they kind of end up making a lot of noise in their district notices, but no one else catches on, and then they get axed. But what I do think is that, there are ways to stand up and challenge and push back on this stuff. You can't make yourself a victim. You can't let them know that you're afraid. Um, you should use the power of social media and the media to your advantage, but be careful that you don't do anything that will give them like a clear grounds for termination. Like there were teachers, and probably what I did too, like Tony Kinnett, like took like basically was a whistleblower. He leaked stuff from district files, and if you do that, that's I think that's great because one, the public's going to see everything, but you're also making it very easy for them to just get rid of you if you very carefully find what you can and can't post, like use the Freedom of Information Act to get information from your district. You should know where to kind of target. You can pull it out. You can post that stuff, and that's public domain. They may not like that you're doing it,
But what
but
about leaking documents, incriminating documents and like curricula to someone else who then doesn't expose your identity? I've heard of that happening
Oh
too.
yeah, yeah. I mean that's a great way to do things too. I think what it comes down to is what do you want your role in this to be? Do you want for some people they want to, and I think this is me, I wanted to be able to come out and say testify to what I'd seen because I felt that it would have more power if someone who was a teacher was saying this directly, not like, hey, but I understand not everyone wants to do that. Using, you know, indirect channels to get stuff out there is probably just as well, probably not as effective as a teacher coming out directly and being like, this is what I saw. And this is my testimony, but it's pretty effective. And, I also think too, look, if you want to stand up as well and you do it smartly, you can have more protection than you might think. But you just have to, it's a risk. The fact that people are awake to this issue and we're talking about it and that more teachers are getting involved is a step in the right direction. And, you know, look, I think that, gosh, 4 years ago, a lot of, teachers that are pushing back now would have been fired immediately. I think that we have made some progress and we'll continue to make it, but we really got to keep the pressure up on them. It's so easy to forget about this because education underlies every other issue. If kids are going into schools from a young age and they're being influenced how to think, how to vote, all those other issues that you care about are going to be determined by the population going through public schools. And so really in my mind, education has to be the foundational issue for conservatives, because as it stands right now, public education is really is the largest institution in the country, through which almost everyone goes